So we've just given a quick refresher about the different elements that make up the red meat integrity system. For the remainder of the webinar, what we're going to do is go into some more detail around those individual LPA requirements and the record keeping that goes with those, because good records and systems are the foundation of the integrity system. So I guess when it comes to record keeping for LPA, there's a couple of things just to point out. There's no perfect formula when it comes to record keeping. In terms of how we keep records, some producers find that keeping clear notes in a diary or a record book works well for them. Others keep their records within their farm management software program or computer spreadsheets, as we've just sort of seen there on the polling. But regardless of the method, it's important that all the relevant management activities are accurately and clearly recorded and capture the required information. So the key takeaway point there is that there's no perfect formula. There's no one size fits all for record keeping. What's important is that you understand the requirements of the Livestock Production Assurance Program and how to meet those requirements, and then you are able to provide the evidence through your records to demonstrate that you're actually meeting those requirements. That's what's key. So should you be required to participate in an LPA audit, your LPA records will be reviewed by an auditor. So it's important to make sure that they're accurate up to date. But it's also important that you don't just get your records in order if you've been contacted about an audit. An audit's not the time to do this, and it shouldn't be the only motivation for doing this. Providing lifetime traceability and the evidence that goes with that through good record keeping can also actually be a marketing advantage when it comes to actually selling your livestock as well. But the good news is, to make it easier for you, we have created record keeping templates which are aligned to the 7 LPA requirements and outline all the information that you need to be recording. Now, these are available on the ISC website or through the LPA Service Centre. You can see there that we've got a little integrity insight up on the screen. We'll have a number of these throughout the webinar this evening. The first one there is around our templates that are available, as I said, on the ISC website. You can order a hard copy through the LPA website or through the service centre, or you can call the ISC customer service team. And don't worry about writing down these details. We'll share all this with you in the post-webinar email. Now, just to be clear, you're not obligated to use these templates if you're already capturing the required information in another format or program. But if you don't currently have a recording system, then they're a great resource to ensure that you're capturing what it is that you need to capture. A recent change has been made to the LPA Service Centre or the LPA website, which now allows all LPA documentation and records to be saved directly within your producer LPA account. And our integrity insight for this new feature is the option you can actually complete your property risk assessment, and your farm biosecurity plans can be completed entirely digitally within the LPA Service Centre rather than completing them on a printed template and uploading them from there. So I guess the benefits of being able to upload all your documents now into the LPA account is that all your records are then saved in one location. You can retrieve them at any time. They're there for easy access for auditing, or if you do need to refer to them. And we do have a fact sheet on how to create or upload documents in your LPA account. This will be on the ISC website, and you can check the post-webinar email for a direct link to that. Now, just before we go into details around records, I guess there's a couple of different types of records that we would be required to be keeping as part of LPA. The first we'd refer to as property management records, which are often completed or reviewed once a year, for example. So these are things like the property risk assessment, the biosecurity plan, and the animal welfare certification. Then there's records which are more operational, and these are records which would be completed daily or weekly, or when you're actually conducting an activity. And these are things like visitor registers for biosecurity, feed and livestock treatment records, commodity vendor decks, national vendor decks, and also your livestock movement records. And I guess just another really important thing to note here is that there are plenty of opportunities to utilise your current record keeping systems for the purposes of LPA for other programs, for example, and that's totally acceptable. As long as all the required information is captured within your records, then it can absolutely apply to a number of different programs. And a good example of that is if there is a biosecurity requirement in a particular state, for example, and you might need to keep records for that purpose, then try and make sure that your records will meet the needs of both programs, and they should do that. Another example is keeping chemical use records as part of your ChemCert or your chemical user accreditation, as well as meeting the requirements for keeping records around chemical use within LPA. Same records would meet the needs of both programs. So what we'll do now is we're going to run through each of the 7 LPA requirement areas and provide some examples of the records that are required for each of these. So the first LPA requirement that we're going to look at is property risk assessment. Now for this requirement, you must identify any possible risk on your property where livestock could come into contact with physical and or chemical contaminants and develop strategies for how this risk will be managed. How do you meet this requirement? You do that by completing a risk assessment and a map. You update the risk assessment when changes occur on farm. You document and file the risk assessment and map for auditing purposes. And you can now complete this, as I said before, digitally within your LPA account. So what we've got here on the screen now is an example risk assessment map. Now this is available as part of the ISC record keeping templates. A risk assessment must be carried out when any changes to the enterprise's current activities occur, such as a change in land use on the property, for example. The risk assessment requires producers to mark on the property map suspect areas such as old yards and dip sites, treated yards, old rubbish dump sites, treated power poles and the like. And you can see that those risk areas are just marked on an example on the screen there. So quite a simple template and a simple map, but basically what you're doing is identifying the risks within your property. So then I guess the next example that we have on the screen is where the risks that you've identified on your map, you then document those and then provide a description of how that particular risk is then being managed to therefore eliminate the risk of contamination to animals. And you can see on the screen here, the types of things that you would be recording within your records is what the possible risk or the risk site is, and then referring back to the map, the reason that the risk has been identified, any results or further information that you've got about that particular risk, and then the description of how the site is managed to eliminate the risk of livestock contamination. And you can see the first example there is about an old rubbish dump. So the reason that's been identified as a risk that within the old rubbish dump there might be old chemical drums or batteries. That producer's done some results, and it's actually identified that dieldrin is present within the soil, so that's absolutely a risk. And then the description there on the right is how they're going to manage that risk. Well, that rubbish dump was fenced out in 2005, so that tells the history of that. You've identified the risk, what the actual risk is, any further evidence that you might have, and how you're going to manage that. And you can see that these templates and examples that we've given here would lend themselves to creating this as an electronic file within Excel or Word, or you could just simply create a table if you'd prefer to fill it out by hand. So the next LPA requirement that we're looking at is around biosecurity. Now for this requirement, you must implement on-farm biosecurity systems to minimise the risk of infectious disease being introduced to livestock production properties and the subsequent spread of any such diseases. Now, to meet this requirement for the purposes of LPA, you need to keep a formal documented farm biosecurity plan that can also be completed digitally in your LPA account. You need to source a livestock health declaration or equivalent for introduced livestock. You need to have systems in place to notify unusual disease, illness or mortalities, and you need to keep records of movements of people, vehicles and equipment entering your property where both reasonable and practical. Now, some producers might have also completed a JBAS or a Yoni's farm biosecurity plan. This will also meet LPA requirements. Now, the other thing to note, particularly with biosecurity, is if you have used another program or template to create a biosecurity plan, and there are plenty of biosecurity plan templates out there, what you need to do is you just need to check that it covers all the required information from the LPA template to ensure that you're compliant with the biosecurity requirements for LPA, but then you will absolutely be able to use that template. And there are plenty of online versions of a biosecurity template as well. Now, just before we go off biosecurity, I'll move on to the example biosecurity plan template there. But basically what it is, you need to address managing and recording the introduction and movement of livestock in a way that minimises the risk of introducing or spreading those infectious diseases. Where reasonable and practical, control people, equipment and vehicles entering the property that would pose a potential risk of either contamination or the spread of infectious pests, diseases and weeds, and keep a record of movement. And also prevent and control animal diseases on farm by regularly monitoring and managing. Now, the key with biosecurity is to focus on what's relevant to your farm and your production system and any specific requirements that relate to your state and territory. It doesn't mean that you tick every box, because some things may not be applicable to your situation. The important thing to consider is what risks apply to your farm, your risk appetite and your business, and how you're going to manage those risks. So a good example, so here on my property where we are in near Yass, in a essentially what's becoming an increasingly peri-urban area. So we actually have 7 neighbours here. We're a superfine merino production operation, a number of neighbours with small herds and small sheep flocks, particularly in crossbreds. And we also have a river that goes through our property. So our biggest issues in terms of biosecurity are lice and also weeds travelling through the river system. So things like fencing and weed control are our biggest priorities for farm biosecurity. If you're in a completely different area, different production system, those risks might not even be relevant to you. You might have to deal with other more significant risks. But the key with biosecurity is it's no one size fits all. It's very much around what's relevant to you and to your operation. On the screen there now, another ISC record keeping template. This one is for a property visitor register that can be used if needed. And you're basically capturing things like the date, the name, the organisation, person's signature, and contact details and why they were there, and in particular part of the farm that they visited, time in and time out. Now, not only are you keeping these records for meeting requirements of LPA and to prepare yourself for an audit if that was required, but these types of records will also be very useful, for example, if you do deal with an incursion of pests, diseases and weeds later on. So you can go back to your records and go, oh yes, well I had this particular visitor at this time, and if I'm seeing a weed infestation in a particular area, well you might be able to identify the source of that and then be able to manage it accordingly going forward. So the next requirement that we'll look at is animal welfare. Now, animal welfare is a really important requirement of LPA that was introduced in October 2017. So to meet this requirement, you need to have a copy of the standards and guidelines accessible as a reference. The person responsible for the property and the LPA accreditation has received training in the standards and guidelines through the LPA learning module and has a certificate to be evidence of that, and also that staff involved in livestock husbandry are familiar with the contents of the standards and guidelines and have been trained in a manner that's consistent with those guidelines. So the integrity insight there is that download the standards and guidelines and save it to your computer so that your team members know where it is and they can access it when they need it. You don't need to print it off and have a hard copy, for example. You can just bookmark it on your computer. But yes, you absolutely need to have that as a readily available for yourself as the LPA accredited producer, plus any staff that are working with or responsible for livestock husbandry on farm. And from a record pointing view for animal welfare, it's a requirement that you complete that LPA learning and receive a certificate of completion and have that available as well should you be required to do an audit. So the LPA requirement that we'll next take a look at is around safe and responsible animal treatments. Now, for this requirement, you must undertake steps to ensure that animal treatments are administered in a safe and responsible manner that minimises the risk of chemical residues and physical hazards to the animal or to people. So how do you meet this requirement? You need to document and file all animal treatment details, complete a chemical user course, note when equipment used for livestock treatment is cleaned, record authorisation and directions for any off-label use of chemicals that might be required, note any animals that have been exposed to physical contaminants like broken needles, and mark animals treated with HGPs with a triangular ear mark. Now, the integrity insight there, little practical tip, is to keep records for a minimum of 3 years in accordance with state legislation, or for the time that the livestock are on the pick, whichever is longer. So an example livestock treatment record we have up here on the screen at the moment for you is just capturing details like the treatment date, the description, the location and the number of the livestock, the product trade name, the batch number is quite important, the dose rate, the dipping or the jetting rate, and the approximate live weight of the animals that were being treated. Take a note of the withholding period or the export slaughter interval, which can quite often be different. And it's also good to note the date safe for slaughter. So rather than having to go back and calculate it as you're about to load animals on the truck to make sure they're not still within a withholding period, note that down when you're actually treating them on the time at the time. And also a good idea to keep a note of who actually treated them. And the practical tip there, the insight is that you can also ask your supplier to add the vet product batch number and expiry date and withholding period details to the invoice when you purchase your products, so that you can get them and have them as a ready reckoner for your treatment records. And if you don't know what the withholding period is or the export slaughter interval, you can visit the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority website, and we'll share those contact details with you in the post-webinar email. So as another part of this requirement is the need for a chemical inventory record. So here we've just got an example on the screen. Again, you can create this in a spreadsheet or a Word doc, or just hand draw it, or you can grab these templates online from ISC, or also you can order a hard copy of these. But basically what you're wanting to do here is to keep notes of, this is your chemical store, I guess. So rather than having to go down and check your batch number, for example, you've got a list of when your expiry dates or your batch numbers all within a central point, so that you don't find out as you go down to start drenching the sheep that your product's gone out of date. Because if you are audited, they will want to look at your chemical inventory. And very important, this is fairly standard practice as well. This is another thing that's not just required for your livestock production assurance. This would be something that would also be required as part of your farm chemical user accreditation as well. Again, you can ask your supplier to add the batch number and the expiry date to the invoice for your treatment records, so that you've got that in the house or in the office, rather than having to go down to the shed and tip the drum upside down and get those details later on. The next requirement that we'll take a look at is stock foods, fodder crops, grain and pasture treatments. So for this requirement, you must guarantee that animals are not exposed to foods containing chemical contamination or fed animal products. So to meet this requirement, you need to keep records of all agricultural chemical treatments on farm. You need to document any introduced stock feed. You need to have management systems to identify livestock that may have become contaminated. You need to map or list the treated or any contaminated sites, and you should also source and file all your commodity vendor decks that accompany any introduced stock feed as well. So here we have an example of a crop, pasture and paddock treatment record. So things that you should be capturing here, and again, this is fairly standard practice for your farm chemical use as well. So again, an example of where records for one program will also apply. As long as you are capturing all the information that's required for LPA, then this record would apply for both. So the date of application, the paddock, the crop that was treated, the area that was treated, who did it, what the application rate was. Wind direction is also something quite useful and important to capture, particularly from a farm chemical use thing. The tank mix, the product, the rate, batch number, all those types of details. Here on the screen, we've got an example of a grain and fodder treatment record. So this is something like hay and silage. And again, very important if you're asked to produce a commodity vendor deck, if you're on selling feed later on as well. So again, the date, the ID of where it was stored or the location, what the product was that was treated, how much it was treated, the application rate and who did it, and then details around the chemical. So the name of the product, the chemical rate, the batch number, withholding period details, the date that's then safe to feed that out, and any other information as well. And here's an example of some a way that you might like to keep records around any introduced stock feed. So again, the date, the feed stuff, the amount that was brought in, the origin of the feed stuff, the commodity vendor deck or equivalent reference number if you've got that, any residue analysis if that was completed, the storage location and where it was signed. And these types of records, I'm sure you're starting to see that, I mean, across, if you were creating a spreadsheet, for example, this would have other uses across your business. So at the end, you could do this on a financial year basis, for example. You could start to build in some cost information as well. And then you're starting to see, well, this is how much I'm purchasing over a year, or you could look at how much you're purchasing and giving to particular grades of stock and things like that as well. This one here is just a livestock feeding record, so again would be useful. I'm thinking particularly in a drought situation, for example. Things that you'd want to capture in this information would be your the description of the feed stuff, where it's been stored, the mob that it was fed to, and the feeding period, so start and finish, and then the person responsible for the activity. And again, other applicable uses might be from a work health and safety point of view. So if you were to have an incident and have to deal with that incident, you could go back and see a little bit more detail about when and who may have been doing a particular activity. So hopefully you're seeing that this record keeping requirements for LPA has value across the rest of your business as well. Just a little bit of information really quickly on the commodity vendor deck. So the commodity vendor deck needs to be, well, basically all introduced stock feed should be accompanied by a commodity vendor declaration to guarantee that the feed purchased is safe from chemical contamination. Now, the commodity vendor deck needs to provide details of the chemical that was used to treat it, the rate and the date of the chemical application, and the relevant withholding period or export slaughter interval or the export animal feed interval as shown on the chemical label. Now, in the when you don't get a commodity vendor deck, you do need to assess the risk and keep a record of it. Alternatively, you can have a sample tested for residues. Now, we will provide a link to the commodity vendor deck in the post-webinar email when we send that out in the next day or two. So the next requirement that we'll take a look at is preparation for dispatch of livestock. Now, for this requirement, you must guarantee that livestock are fit to transport and ensure that they experience minimal stress and contamination during assembly and transport. So how you meet this particular requirement is that you need to ensure all livestock are fit to load. You need to record transport details, including the vehicle rego and the key times in the transport and in the lead up to, and you need to document and file all your national vendor decks and record reports of animals which may have been exposed to any physical contaminants. Now, the really key practical tip here is to keep a copy handy of the is the animal fit to load guide or the fit to load guide. It's got some really handy pictures in there, particularly useful looking at injured animals or animals that might have had cancer or injuries, but also helps with looking at condition score, particularly in drought as well. Here's just an example of a preparation of livestock for dispatch record that you might like to keep. So things like the date, the number of head, the description, the date and time of yarding, the date and time of dispatch, and any further notes that you might have had there. So, and again, really useful over a year, for example, or if you're wanting to go back and look at particular history of an animal. For the requirement, which is livestock transactions and movements, you basically got to guarantee that animals sold are not exposed to food safety hazards and that they meet all traceability requirements should a safety issue occur. So how do you go about meeting this requirement? You need to record all purchases and sales. You need to keep copies of all national vendor decks. You need to record the vendor's name, address and PIC, record the livestock details and their description, keep records of all animals purchased while within a withholding period or export slaughter interval, and document animals that may have been exposed to any physical contaminants.
Okay, so Lisa Burrows from New South Wales DPI, we might just get you to unmute yourself. So when we were preparing for this webinar, you were telling us that this has been a real issue in New South Wales at the moment. So can you just give us a bit more information about what's happened and why it's really, really important to get these transfers right?
Thanks, Deanna, and thanks, Kathleen. So in New South Wales, DPI and local land services have had some instances where New South Wales properties have been buying sheep by Auctions Plus, for example, like even from other states, and gathering them on their property, and they didn't record the movements in the NLIS database, and then on-sold the sheep in different mobs, and then at the next property, some of the sheep were diagnosed with foot rot, but because the previous movements hadn't been recorded in NLIS, these sheep are nearly untraceable, and it makes it really difficult for the district vets to trace and contact previous properties and to manage the endemic disease. So that's one example. And then local land services have advised us that they go on, many property visits for animal health reasons, and talking to the owners, they talk about livestock that they've bought, and many times they've said to us that the sheep or cattle bought on Auctions Plus on these properties, the movements haven't been recorded in the NLIS database, which doesn't help us when we're trying to manage an endemic disease outbreak or for a worse an exotic disease outbreak. So we need to be able to trace animals to be able to manage those problems.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Really practical example of why getting this stuff right is really, really important. So back to you, Kathleen.
Thanks so much, Dee, and thanks, Lisa, for that really great practical example there. So one of the parts of that requirement is around the national vendor deck, and make sure that you're actually completing those. So the biggest tip to stand by what you sell is to fill in every LPA NVD correctly, and the aim is to make sure that every NVD is filled out so that it is clear, complete and correct. Now I will just chat a little bit about the NVD very quickly. So the questions in part A of the NVD are often where producers need a bit of a hand. Now, these are the questions about the animal's history. Now, this information is crucial for food safety and market access. So the key here is to stay on the safe side. And if in doubt, tick yes. And importantly, check your records to be sure. Now, the only question where you would not tick yes to stay on the safe side is the question about the livestock ownership. If you've bred the livestock, then you need to tick yes. However, if you've purchased one or more animals that are in the consignment covered by the NVD, then you need to tick no and indicate the most recent date of purchase. Now, the other thing to note to be really careful of with the NVD in Part A is the consigned to and the destination of the consignment. Now, sometimes these can be different and they have different property identification codes, and it's important that you identify this on the NVD. In the consigned to section, you must record the full name and address of the person and or company that the livestock are being consigned to. And in some instances, the address given in the consigned to is different to the actual physical location that the livestock are being sent to. And a really good example of that is when you're transporting livestock to be sold at a sale yard. The consignee would then be the agent, and the destination is the sale yard location. Now, there's lots and lots of tips on filling in the national vendor deck, so it is clear, complete and correct, and we'll share these with you after the webinar. The other part, or the final step in part A of the NVD, is the declaration. Now, when you tick the box on your LPA NVD, you are guaranteeing that your on-farm practices meet the LPA requirements and ultimately customer expectations. And your tick and your signature needs to be backed up by accurate farm records. And of course, for those that are LPA accredited, you also now have access to the faster, easier eNVD system. It's more accurate than paper forms and ensures that the latest version of the NVD are being used, reduces time and duplication spent completing livestock assurance and health declarations. It reduces the cost of storing and retrieving historical consignments for auditing purposes, for example, or any other admin purposes that you might need, or if you're going up and updating your record keeping, for example, and you need to go back and access them, it's really easy to do if you're on the eNVD platform. And you don't need to wait for new NVD books to arrive. And stakeholders in the value chain can also log in and view consignments, including receivers, based on their pick. Now, the eNVD is not just a national vendor deck, it's actually a system for completing all your consignment paperwork digitally, including livestock assurance and health declarations. And you can access the eNVD system by logging in using your LPA login details, and you can start creating consignments from there. So the other aspects to this particular LPA requirement were around recording livestock movements through the national NLIS. So you must record all your livestock movements onto your PIC and the NLIS database to remain LPA accredited. Now, if a producer is selected for an audit, the auditor will review whether the transfers for livestock moved onto their PIC have been recorded on the database accurately. The integrity insight there is that state legislation also requires that the buyer or receiver of the livestock completes the transfer on the database, and that penalties may be imposed by your state and territory government for failing to complete those transfers as required. Here's just an example of some record keeping templates, the details that you might like to capture to meet that LPA requirement for livestock purchases. So this is for animals that are moving onto a property. So date, the NVD serial number, details around the number of stock and the destination paddock. That helps, of course, with biosecurity, the breed, the sex, the vendor name, address and pics for any of those historical issues, or if you might need to go back to a vendor, for example, and any other observations that you might have seen with that particular group of animals. The one here on the screen is for livestock sales and movement records, so for animals going off the property. So again, keeping an eye on keeping details of the date, the NVD serial number, the number of stock, the paddock where they were on the property before they left, the breed, the sex and the destination. So again, thinking back to Lisa's example around foot rot, for example, it's really useful if you've got a record of where all those animals have been, where they've moved. So then you might even be able to manage quarantine and biosecurity better on your individual property, for example. So that's taken us through each of the LPA requirements and what's required to meet each of those, I guess, elements of the program, and then some examples of the record keeping that you can do. I just wanted to touch very briefly before we finish up on audits and what actually is involved. But basically, I guess the key message there is that don't panic, that audits are actually about identifying areas for practical improvement on farm. It's a condition of LPA accreditation that producers agree to participate in an audit. Refusal to participate may result in your accreditation being withdrawn. Audits can be conducted now both remotely or on farm. What happens if you are selected for an audit is that you'll receive notification and an information pack that will help you prepare for the process. Now, producers selected for a remote audit can upload evidence of your record keeping and documents directly into your LPA account, where they are then reviewed by an auditor. So remote audits don't typically include an on-farm visit. Now, LPA audits are conducted each year to ensure that the management systems introduced by our livestock producers comply with those LPA rules and standards. And they really are just a check that Australia's red meat integrity system is working, and therefore it's providing that customer assurance to our customers all around the world. Now, all LPA accredited producers may be audited. People selected for audits are selected at random from the database of all the LPA accredited producers, and that includes producers with just a few livestock. There's about 3,000 audits conducted each year, and reviewing your on-farm practices against the audit checklist, regardless of whether or not you've been identified for an audit or chosen to do an audit, will help you identify any areas that may need attention, not only before an audit, but certainly just in terms of you getting your record keeping up to date. And as I said right at the start, it's a good idea not to just start record keeping when you've been identified for an audit. And it's important to know that your LPA records that we've just been through will absolutely be reviewed by an auditor. So it's really important to make sure that these are accurate and up to date. So what happens if issues are identified during an audit? So if the issue is minor, the auditor can record an observation, which means that you as a producer should consider taking action to improve the relevant practice on your property. So an example here would be such as not obtaining a commodity vendor deck for purchase fodder, or not correctly completing an NVD where the destination and consigned have a different address, for example. If the issue is more significant, the auditor may raise what's known as a corrective action request, or a CAR, which means that you actually need to take action to ensure that compliance with the LPA requirements is demonstrated, and that this evidence then needs to be provided in order to close out that CAR. Now, an example of a common CAR is where there is no biosecurity plan in place, or there's discrepancies between national vendor decks and NLIS transfers on the database. So CARs or corrective actions can be managed by emailing the required evidence directly to the auditor, or by uploading the evidence to the LPA account now, which is that recently added feature to the LPA Service Centre. Now, the practical tip there, or the integrity insight, is you can access your how to respond to an LPA corrective action fact sheet on the Integrity Systems Company website now. And we will circulate the link following tonight's webinar. Which brings me very close to the end, which is, where do you go to find some more information? So we have the ISC website. The link's there on your screen, but we'll provide you with a direct link. We've got lots of information about the different program requirements. We've got the templates and the examples and fact sheets, checklists for each of the requirements as part of LPA available on the ISC website. And you can also go to the LPA Service Centre directly into your account, where, of course, you can now store your online records online as well. For other information, we have our monthly Integrity Matters email, which goes out to all LPA accredited producers. If you don't receive that and you would like to, you can subscribe through our website, or contact us once you receive that email in a day or two directly, and we can make sure that you receive that going forward. We're on all the social and digital platforms listed there, so Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. We've got some great animations and resources on YouTube to help you complete your NVDs, use the eNVD, get a better understanding of the integrity system and the like. So there's some really practical tools there as well. And just before I finish, I did need to just say that the National Vendor Deck in particular is a declaration. It is your declaration. It's a legal document. We can't do it for you. Your livestock agent can't do it for you. We certainly can help to do that and give you some advice. And as I said, we've got a number of tools and resources that are available to make it easier for you. But really important to understand that the integrity system is a really important part of being livestock producers, and as I said at the start, it really does underpin our market access all around the world.